Rancher lived alone for years, until he found a hanged Apache girl. John Miller had lived on the same stretch of land for more than 30 years. The ranch, a wide-open expanse of dusty fields, rolling hills, and rugged cliffs, was isolated from the nearest town by miles of empty desert roads. To most people, it might have seemed lonely, even lonely to the point of being unbearable. But John had grown used to the silence. The only sounds he heard on most days were the wind rustling through the tall grass, the soft lowing of cattle, and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. Over time, he had come to find comfort in that quiet, in the rhythm of life that moved slowly, measured only by the rising and setting of the sun. In the early morning, John would wake before dawn. The sky was often painted with soft shades of pink and gold, and the air carried the scent of dry earth and sage. His first task was always the same: feeding the livestock. He would step out of his small, weather-worn cabin and walk toward the barn, his boots crunching over the dry soil. The cows and horses, familiar with his routine, would gather near the fences, nudging him for attention and food. John would greet each one, calling their names as if they could understand him. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a strange habit, talking to animals, but for John it was a connection to the world around him, a world that, for years, had been his only company. After tending to the animals, John would inspect the fences. Living alone on such a large property required constant attention. Fences were the only thing keeping his cattle from wandering off into the vast wilderness. Broken boards, loose wires, and leaning posts had to be repaired quickly. He worked with a methodical patience, measuring each post and hammering each nail with care. Sometimes he would pause and look out over the landscape, letting his eyes follow the distant hills, the dry riverbeds, and the occasional patches of green where wild plants managed to grow. In these moments he felt the weight of solitude, but also the peace that came with living simply, in harmony with the land. Meals were quiet affairs. John cooked for himself using simple ingredients: eggs from his own hens, vegetables from a small garden he maintained near the cabin, and bread he baked himself. Sitting at the wooden table by the window, he often watched the sunlight move across the ranch. Sometimes he would think about the years that had passed since he first moved here, about the friends he had left behind in town, and about the life he had chosen. There had been moments, especially in the beginning, when loneliness felt unbearable. Nights were long and dark, and the wind sometimes sounded like voices whispering through the trees. But over time, John learned to enjoy the quiet, to find company in the land itself. Books were another important part of John's life. He had a modest collection, most of them well-worn and filled with notes in the margins. Some were about ranching, some about history, and some were novels that transported him to other worlds. On particularly hot afternoons, when the sun was high and the air shimmered with heat, John would retreat to a small chair on the porch, a book in hand, and lose himself in stories far removed from the isolation of the desert. Reading gave him a sense of connection to people and places he would never see, and it offered a quiet escape from the relentless sameness of daily life. Though John lived alone, he was not entirely cut off from the world. Once or twice a month, he would make the long drive into the nearest town. He went to buy supplies, pick up mail, or visit the small general store that had served the community for decades. These trips were brief, and he preferred to stay unnoticed, exchanging only a few words with the shopkeeper before returning to the safety of his solitude. Yet, even in these moments, John could feel the pull of human connection, the subtle warmth of being around other people. He enjoyed these brief encounters, even if they reminded him of the life he had left behind. Animals were more than just livestock to John. He had a few dogs that followed him everywhere, their paws kicking up dust as they ran alongside him on the trails. They were loyal companions, always alert and always aware of his moods. On long evenings, John would sit by the fire, the dogs curled at his feet, and think about the life he had built. The ranch was his kingdom, and the animals were his family. He had learned to read the signs of the land, the way the wind shifted, the tracks left by deer or coyotes, the patterns in the clouds that predicted storms. Living alone had made him observant, patient, and resilient. There were also moments of reflection that sometimes weighed heavily on him. John had not always been alone. Many years ago, he had a family, a wife, children, and a bustling household filled with laughter and noise. But life had changed, as it often does, and now he was left with memories that came unbidden, especially in the quiet hours of the night. Sometimes he would sit by the window, watching the moon rise over the hills, and feel a pang of longing for the life he had once known. Yet he did not dwell on sadness for long. Instead, he focused on the small joys of the present, the warmth of the sun on his back, the sound of a bird singing in the morning, the gentle nuzzle of a horse seeking attention. Seasons changed slowly on the ranch. Summers were dry and hot, with dust rising from the earth and the occasional lightning storm lighting up the horizon. Winters brought cold nights and occasional snow, blanketing the landscape in white and silencing the desert with a frozen stillness. John adapted to each season, learning to read the signs in nature, storing hay and firewood in preparation for the harsher months. Life was a series of routines, each day blending into the next, but he never tired of the rhythm. There was a comforting predictability in knowing what to expect, in understanding the land as if it were an old friend. Occasionally, John would notice traces of people passing through. A set of footprints in the sand, a campfire long since extinguished, or a discarded bottle along the trail would spark his curiosity. But he would examine them carefully, wondering who had been there and why. But he rarely pursued the matter further. Over the years, he had learned to respect the boundaries of his solitude and to trust his instincts when something seemed unusual. The land had taught him vigilance, patience, and the quiet understanding that not all mysteries needed immediate answers. Despite the long stretches of solitude, John never felt entirely disconnected. The ranch was alive with its own rhythms and secrets. He took joy in the smallest signs of life: a new calf born in the early morning light, a fox darting across the field, the gentle sway of trees in the wind. These moments reminded him that he was part of something larger, a world that moved with its own logic and beauty, independent of human presence. Over time, he had come to see his isolation not as loneliness, but as a deep, intimate connection with the land itself. And so, life on the ranch continued, day after day, year after year. John Miller, the solitary rancher, existed in a world of silence, rhythm, and quiet reflection. The land was his companion, the animals his friends, and the routines of daily life his anchor. He had built a life of simplicity, resilience, and quiet strength, unaware that soon something entirely unexpected would break the stillness, a moment that would challenge everything he had known about solitude, life, and the fragile connections that tie people together. John Miller had been riding along the northern trail of his ranch that morning, as he often did, checking fences and inspecting the edges of the property where the land grew rougher and the shrubs became thicker. The sun was already climbing high into the sky, and the heat made the air shimmer. His hat shaded his face, but sweat ran down his back as he nudged his horse along the dry, rocky path. The trail had not been used much lately, and for weeks he had noticed that certain boards in the fence were leaning or broken. It was important to fix them before any cattle wandered off. As he guided his horse through a small cluster of mesquite trees, something unusual caught his eye. At first he thought it might be a shadow cast by the branches, or perhaps the twisted shape of a branch itself. But as he looked closer, a chill ran down his spine. There, hanging from one of the trees, was a figure. John's heart skipped a beat. His eyes widened, and his hand instinctively reached for the reins to pull his horse back a few steps. The figure swayed slightly in the heat-baked wind, motionless in a way that told him immediately something was terribly wrong. John dismounted slowly, keeping his eyes on the figure. He felt a mix of fear, disbelief, and a strange, heavy sadness. The closer he stepped, the more he realized that it was not a scarecrow or an abandoned object. It was a young girl. Her clothing was simple but worn, her hair dark and tangled, and her small frame suggested she could not have been more than 12 years old. The sight struck him harder than he expected. Years of solitude had taught him to be calm in emergencies, but this was different. This was life and death in its most sudden, tragic form. For a moment, he could not speak. He could only stare, feeling the heat of the sun on his back while a cold shock ran through him. The girl's head hung forward slightly, and her body swayed gently in the wind. John's stomach churned, and his hand shook as he reached for his hat and pressed it to his chest, as if trying to steady himself. He had faced many challenges on this ranch, storms, wild animals, and accidents, but nothing compared to this. His mind raced. How had she come here? How long had she been there? Why had no one seen her before? John's first instinct was to check for signs of life, though he knew in his heart what the answer would be. He knelt carefully, placing his hands near her pulse, but it was clear she was gone. The reality hit him like a heavy rock. She was a child, a human being, alone in the vast desert, who had ended up in the most tragic way. The ranch, which had always been a place of quiet and order, now felt eerie and oppressive. Even the animals nearby seemed to sense the change. A crow cawed in the distance, and the wind seemed to whisper through the trees with a somber, mournful tone. John stood up slowly, breathing heavily, trying to clear his mind and think clearly. He knew he had to act, but he also had to be careful. Moving her body could destroy evidence, and he had no training beyond what common sense taught him. He looked around, noting the footprints in the soft dirt leading to the tree and the small objects scattered nearby. A discarded scarf, a broken branch that suggested she had struggled. His eyes caught a glint of something on the ground, and he bent down to examine it. It appeared to be a small personal item, a charm or trinket of some kind. Worn and scratched, John pocketed it, thinking it might help authorities later. The ranch was remote. No one would see him from miles around, and he realized that the first and most important step was to contact the sheriff. His hands trembled slightly as he mounted his horse again, glancing back at the tree one last time. He whispered a short, solemn prayer for the girl, though he wasn't a particularly religious man. Words felt useless in the face of such a tragedy, but it was a way to honor her, to acknowledge that she had existed, even if only for a brief and difficult life. The ride to town was long and quiet. John's horse moved steadily along the dirt trail, kicking up dust that shimmered in the sun. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and emotions. He thought about the girl's family, wherever they might be, and about how someone so young could end up alone in this harsh landscape. The thought made his chest tighten, and he found himself whispering her name, even though he did not know it. He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, a desire to help, to do something that might prevent this from happening to someone else. When he finally reached the town, the small community was going about its daily routine, unaware of the tragedy that had occurred miles away. John went straight to the sheriff's office, dismounting his horse outside and taking a moment to steady his breath. The sheriff, a man named Tom Whitaker, looked up from his desk, eyebrows raised in mild surprise. "Morning, John. Everything okay?" he asked casually. John shook his head, his voice tight with urgency. There's a girl," he said finally, his words coming slowly. She's dead, hanging from a tree on my ranch." The sheriff's face changed immediately. Whitaker grabbed his hat and keys and motioned for John to follow. "Lead the way. We'll take care of it." Back on the ranch, the reality of the situation hit even harder with the sheriff present. Deputies arrived, setting up tape around the area and taking photographs. John explained everything he had seen, describing the trail, the condition of the tree, and the surrounding landscape. He showed them the small charm he had found, which they bagged as potential evidence. Throughout it all, John felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that he was no longer alone in witnessing this horror, and sorrow that the girl's life had ended so tragically. As the investigation began, John could not stop thinking about the girl. He imagined her arriving at the ranch, perhaps running from something, perhaps lost and afraid. He pictured her trying to survive in a world that had offered her no protection, no guidance, and no safety. The thought was unbearable, yet he knew that remembering her in this way was important. It was the only way to honor her memory. For days afterward, John remained close to the ranch, even though investigators were coming and going, questioning him and documenting the scene. The trail, the tree, and the surrounding land became a place of quiet reflection for him. He walked along the paths he had known for decades, seeing them now through the lens of tragedy. Every shadow, every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves reminded him of the fragility of life and the unpredictability of the world around him. Even the animals seemed to sense the change. His dog stayed close to him more than usual, nudging his hands for reassurance, while the horses grew restless, as if aware that something was different. John spoke to them gently, though his voice often broke with emotion. He felt their silent companionship, their steady presence, and it reminded him that even in the darkest moments, he was not completely alone. In the evenings, John would sit on the porch, staring at the horizon where the sun dipped behind the hills. The sky was painted with deep oranges and purples, and the air carried the faint chill of approaching night. He thought about what had happened and the girl who had been found on his land. He felt a deep sadness, mixed with an odd sense of responsibility. He could not undo what had occurred, but he could bear witness, tell the truth, and perhaps help ensure that her story was not forgotten. In those quiet hours, the ranch, once a place of simple solitude, felt heavy with memory and sorrow. John realized that life had changed in a way he could not have predicted. The land, which had always been a sanctuary, now carried the weight of tragedy, and he carried it with him in his heart. The experience had shaken his sense of peace, but it had also awakened a new understanding of his place in the world. A recognition that even in the most remote corners of life, events beyond his control could ripple through existence, touching lives and leaving marks that could never be erased. And so, the ranch, the land, and the quiet life John had known were transformed forever. What had once been a routine, predictable existence was now imbued with the memory of a child he would never forget. The simple rhythms of feeding animals, repairing fences, and tending to daily chores were overlaid with the shadow of tragedy, a constant reminder that even in solitude, the world could intrude in ways no one could anticipate. John Miller had returned to his ranch after the initial shock of discovering the girl. Even though deputies and the sheriff had come and gone, A memory of what he had seen hung over him like a heavy cloud. He tried to return to his daily routines, feeding the cattle, repairing fences, and tending to the garden, but the ranch felt different now. Every tree, every path, every hill seemed to carry the memory of the young girl he had found. Her presence, though gone, lingered in every shadow and every gust of wind. The sheriff called him back to town the next day. John knew it was not for punishment, but to help with the investigation. He rode in quietly, feeling the weight of the responsibility he now carried. Sheriff Whitaker and the deputies had begun piecing together what little evidence there was. There were footprints near the trail, a few discarded items that suggested the girl had been traveling alone, and the small charm John had found near the tree. Though the clues were sparse, they were vital, and John's observations of the land became central to the investigation. At the sheriff's office, John was asked to recount everything he remembered. Step by step, he described the trail, the position of the tree, the way the branches had swayed, and the objects scattered on the ground. He explained how he had noticed footprints leading toward the tree, and how he had not seen anyone else in the area in the days leading up to the discovery. Sheriff Whitaker listened closely, taking notes while the deputies photographed and measured everything John described. John felt a mixture of pride and unease. He had never wanted attention, but he knew that his knowledge of the land could make a difference in understanding what had happened. The investigation quickly revealed that the girl was likely a young member of the local Apache community. Her name had not yet been confirmed, but whispers among the town's residents suggested that she might have run away from her home. John had never met her, and yet he felt a deep connection, a responsibility he could not explain. He spent the evenings thinking about her life, imagining the hardships she must have faced, and wondering if anyone had tried to help her. The thought was painful, but it fueled his determination to be part of the solution, to ensure that her story was told and that the truth was uncovered. John also noticed how the community began reacting to the news. Townspeople whispered in the streets, mothers held their children a little tighter, and neighbors discussed what could have been done to prevent such a tragedy. John found himself listening quietly, absorbing the different opinions, feeling both the judgment and the compassion in their words. The event had touched everyone in the small town, and for the first time in years, John felt a connection to people he had avoided for so long. Though the connection was born of tragedy, it reminded him that life was shared, even when one preferred solitude. The sheriff and deputies worked tirelessly, interviewing anyone who might have seen the girl, checking the surrounding areas, and contacting nearby reservations and schools. They asked John to accompany them on some of these trips, using his knowledge of the land to trace possible paths she might have taken. John felt a sense of purpose he had not experienced in years. Riding alongside the investigators, pointing out landmarks and hidden trails, he realized that his years of living in isolation had prepared him for this moment. His familiarity with every hill, every creek, and every clearing made him an invaluable guide. At the ranch, life continued, but nothing was the same. The animals seemed aware of the tension in the air. The dogs stayed closer, their eyes following John as he moved through the yard. Even the horses seemed quieter, as if they understood that the ranch had become a place marked by sadness. John found himself speaking to the animals more than ever, sharing his thoughts and fears, seeking comfort in their presence. They offered him silent companionship, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there were still living beings who depended on him, who looked to him for care and stability. Days turned into weeks, and John became deeply involved in the investigation. He rode long trails, checking for new clues, searching areas the deputies had not yet covered. Sometimes he found footprints or disturbed soil, other times nothing at all. Each discovery brought hope. Each dead end brought frustration. He kept meticulous notes, recording the direction of tracks, the condition of the land, and anything unusual he observed. The work was exhausting, but he refused to give up. The girl's life mattered, and he could not stand by and do nothing. At night, John often sat by the fire, thinking about what he had learned. The sheriff had begun piecing together a timeline, but many questions remained unanswered. Who had been responsible for her being alone? Why had no one noticed her sooner? Could her life have been saved if someone had intervened earlier? John felt helpless at times, but he also felt a growing determination to make a difference. He realized that though he had lived in isolation for decades, he now had a chance to connect with the world in a meaningful way, to help ensure that justice was served and that the girl's story would not be forgotten. One evening, as he returned from a long ride across the northern trails, John stopped at the edge of a small clearing. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the land, and the wind carried a soft rustle through the trees. He paused, closing his eyes for a moment, imagining the girl running along this very path, frightened and alone. The thought made his chest ache. He knelt briefly, placing his hand on the earth as if to communicate with her, promising that he would do everything he could to help, to protect, even after her passing. The quiet of the evening pressed around him, and for a brief moment, he felt her presence in the stillness, a reminder of the life that had been lost. As the investigation progressed, John began spending more time in town, assisting the sheriff with interviews, and providing insights about the land and its surroundings. He discovered that the girl had been seen near a small town miles away, but no one had realized she was in danger. The threads of her story slowly came together, revealing a child who had faced neglect and uncertainty, seeking safety in a world that was not always kind. John felt both sorrow and anger, but he channeled those emotions into determination, using his knowledge and his voice to aid the investigation. Despite the intensity of the work, John continued to care for the ranch. The daily tasks of feeding animals and repairing fences became moments of reflection, allowing him to process the events around him. Each chore was done with a new purpose, a reminder that life continued even in the shadow of tragedy. He found that the combination of physical work and mental focus on the investigation helped him manage the weight of grief. The land, which had once been a place of quiet solitude, now became a place of action, a space where he could contribute to something larger than himself. As the weeks went on, John began forming connections with members of the local Apache community. He learned more about their culture, their traditions, and their concerns. He listened carefully, aware that his long absence from community life had left him with much to learn. The tragedy of the girl's death had created a bridge between him and the people he had never interacted with before. In helping with the investigation, he discovered the power of empathy and the importance of standing with others in times of need. John also began to notice small changes in himself. The loneliness that had once defined his life felt less oppressive. He realized that connection, even in unexpected and painful ways, was possible. By assisting with the investigation and by engaging with the community, he had found a new sense of purpose. He understood that life was fragile and that his knowledge and actions could make a difference, even if only in small ways. The girl's story had brought him out of isolation, forcing him to confront emotions he had long avoided and to embrace responsibilities he had never imagined. Finally, after days of careful work and coordination, the sheriff announced that they had gathered enough information to move forward. The girl had been identified, and the timeline of her journey had been reconstructed. John listened quietly as the details emerged. Each piece of information was painful, yet important. He felt a mixture of relief and sorrow, relief that the truth was beginning to emerge, and sorrow for the life that had ended too soon. He knew the path ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that he had done everything he could to help. And so, life on the ranch continued, but with a new sense of purpose. John remained deeply involved in the investigation, riding the trails, providing insight, and offering support wherever it was needed. The land, once a place of quiet solitude, now bore witness to a story of tragedy and compassion. John had discovered that even in isolation, one could make a difference, and that sometimes the most unexpected events could awaken empathy and connection in ways that transformed life forever. Days had passed since John Miller had first discovered the young girl on his ranch. The sheriff and his deputies had been working tirelessly, piecing together every clue and interviewing anyone who might have known the girl. John found himself caught between relief that progress was being made and the ever-present sadness of knowing what had happened. He spent long hours riding across the ranch, checking the land and thinking about her life, trying to imagine what she had endured before reaching his property. The investigation had taken John into the town and even into the nearby Apache reservation. There he met community leaders who spoke cautiously, concerned for the girl's family and for the privacy of the community. Slowly he began to learn her name, Marissa Yazzie. She had been only 12 years old, full of life and curiosity, but her life had been complicated. She had run away from home for reasons that no one could fully understand at first, maybe fear, maybe confusion, or perhaps a desire to escape challenges she could not handle at that age. The reality of Marissa's life weighed heavily on John's heart. He had seen her only in the tragic moment of her death, yet he now felt responsible for ensuring her story was heard. John's knowledge of the land became more crucial than ever. Investigators relied on him to trace the paths Marissa might have taken. He pointed out hidden creeks where she could have rested, abandoned trails where footprints were likely to disappear, and shaded areas where she might have sought shelter from the sun. As he guided them, he imagined her moving through the terrain, frightened and alone, searching for safety and comfort. Every detail he provided helped reconstruct her final hours, and John found himself overwhelmed by the gravity of the task. He had never been so closely connected to someone else's story, and the weight of that connection stayed with him long after the sun dipped below the horizon each day. Meanwhile, the town itself was buzzing with speculation. Families spoke quietly about the tragedy, and some parents became more protective of their children. John, who had lived most of his life in isolation, found himself listening to these conversations with a mixture of curiosity and empathy. He realized how fragile childhood could be, how easily a child could find herself in danger, and how important it was for adults to remain vigilant. These thoughts only deepened his commitment to the investigation, and he spent every spare moment assisting the sheriff and deputies wherever he could. Through careful investigation and interviews, the authorities began to piece together Marissa's journey. She had left her home early one morning, likely seeking freedom from circumstances she did not fully understand. She had traveled on foot for miles, attempting to navigate unfamiliar terrain with the courage and determination that only a child could summon in such dire circumstances. John could picture her small hands brushing against rocks and brush as she walked, her eyes scanning the horizon for signs of help, her heart beating with both hope and fear. It was a haunting vision, one that stayed with him as he worked the ranch in the quiet mornings and evenings. The sheriff shared with John the first concrete clues about the people who might have been involved in her disappearance. There were adults who had been aware of her plans but had failed to act, perhaps out of neglect, indifference, or fear. Each revelation was painful, but it also brought clarity. John felt a mix of anger and sorrow, knowing that a life had been lost unnecessarily. Yet he also recognized the resilience and bravery Marissa had shown. Despite her young age, she had tried to navigate a difficult and confusing world, and that courage demanded acknowledgement. John's connection to the investigation grew deeper when he was asked to attend a community meeting on the reservation. Leaders spoke about the importance of preserving the dignity of Marissa's memory and ensuring that her story was told accurately. John listened quietly, absorbing every word. He realized that the tragedy was bigger than just one life. It affected families, communities, and even the broader society that had failed to protect her. For John, this realization was profound. He had always lived apart from the world, but now he was directly involved in shaping a response that could bring awareness, justice, and healing. As the investigation approached its climax, the details of Marissa's final hours became clearer. John revisited the ranch with the sheriff and deputies, tracing the precise path she had taken and noting the spots where she might have sought water or shade. Every small detail mattered. They discovered broken branches and footprints that corroborated earlier reports, confirming that she had struggled to find her way in the harsh desert terrain. John's observations, honed over decades of living on the land, proved invaluable. He realized that even though he had once sought solitude, his knowledge and experience could now serve a greater purpose. The emotional weight of the investigation took its toll on John. Some nights he would sit alone on the porch, staring at the stars, thinking about Marissa's life and the choices she had made. He wondered what she had been thinking in her final hours and whether she had felt fear, hope, or longing. Though he could never know for certain, he imagined her as a brave and spirited girl trying to navigate a world that had been unfair to her. The sadness he felt was tempered by a quiet respect for her courage. One afternoon, John received news that the authorities had located Marissa's family. The reunion, though tragic, brought some answers and clarity. Her parents were devastated, filled with grief and regret, but they also shared stories of her kindness, curiosity, and resilience. John listened, moved by their words, and felt a deep empathy for them. Though he had not known Marissa in life, he now understood her as a person, not just as a victim. He felt a responsibility to carry her memory forward, ensuring that her life and her struggles would not be forgotten. The investigation revealed that Marissa's situation had been complicated by neglect, lack of supervision, and miscommunication among adults responsible for her care. John felt both sorrow and anger as he absorbed the details. He realized that the tragedy was not just about one girl's death. It was about a system that had failed her and a community now tasked with learning from the mistakes of the past. He resolved to do what he could to help prevent similar tragedies, whether through sharing his story, supporting local programs, or simply staying vigilant on the ranch he loved. Despite the emotional weight, John found moments of reflection and healing. He returned to the ranch each day, tending to the animals, repairing fences, and walking along the trails where Marissa had traveled. The land, which had once been a place of quiet solitude, now carried memory and purpose. John spoke to the animals gently, sharing his thoughts and feelings, and found comfort in their presence. The simple routines of ranch life, combined with the work of the investigation, helped him process the sorrow and turn it into determination. In the weeks following the discovery, John continued to assist the authorities. He provided guidance on the land, offered his perspective on potential witnesses, and even helped organize a small memorial for Marissa. The community came together, honoring her life and reflecting on the lessons of her story. John's involvement had transformed him, drawing him out of the isolation he had lived in for decades and connecting him to people who shared a common sense of responsibility and compassion. Through it all, John never forgot the image of Marissa in the mesquite tree, the moment that had first shattered his solitude. But he had also learned to see beyond the tragedy, to recognize her bravery, her spirit, and the importance of ensuring that her story was told. The investigation had revealed the challenges she faced, the struggles she endured, and the moments of courage that defined her brief life. For John, these insights brought both sorrow and a renewed sense of purpose. As the investigation reached its conclusion, John reflected on what he had learned. Life on the ranch, once defined by solitude and routine, had been forever changed. He understood that even in the most remote corners of the world, the lives of others could intersect with his own in unexpected ways. Marissa's story had brought him into a community, connected him to people he had never known, and reminded him of the fragility and preciousness of life. Though he could not change the past, he had helped honor it, ensuring that her story would be remembered and that her life, though brief, had meaning. John's days slowly returned to a new normal. The ranch continued to require care and attention, but each task was now done with a deeper sense of awareness and purpose. He maintained the trails, repaired the fences, and tended to the animals, all while carrying the memory of Marissa with him. Her story had become a part of his own, shaping how he saw the land, the people, and the responsibilities he held. He had been a solitary rancher for decades, but now he was part of a larger narrative, one that honored a life that had been lost and celebrated the courage and resilience of a young girl who had touched his heart forever. The weeks and months after Marissa's death brought a quiet change to John Miller's life. The initial shock of discovering her had long passed, but the memory of that moment remained vivid in his mind. The mesquite tree where she had been found was still part of the Northern Trail, and every time he passed it, he felt a mix of sorrow and responsibility. John had learned to live with solitude over decades, but this experience had shown him that isolation could not shield him from the wider world. Life had a way of reaching in, of reminding even the loneliest heart that it was connected to others in ways both painful and profound. The investigation had concluded, and the authorities had made their findings clear. Marissa's story was known, and her family, though grieving deeply, had received answers and some measure of closure. John had been present for meetings with her parents, listening to their recollections of her life, learning about her laughter, her curiosity, and the small moments that had made her who she was. The sorrow of her loss was immense, but it had also created a connection between John and the family, and between him and the community he had long avoided. For the first time in decades, he felt part of something larger than himself. Life on the ranch returned to a routine, but it was a different routine now. Feeding cattle, tending the horses, mending fences, and walking along familiar trails all carried a new sense of awareness. John no longer moved through the land solely in solitude. He moved with memory, respect, and a sense of purpose. Each tree, each clearing, each winding path reminded him of Marissa and the fragile lives that could cross his world without warning. He spoke of her softly to the animals, recounting imagined conversations as though they could understand. In some ways, it helped him process the sorrow, giving it a form that could be carried gently rather than buried in silence. The Apache community had welcomed his presence cautiously at first. He had lived apart from them for years, and his sudden involvement in Marissa's story was unexpected. Yet over time, he began to earn their trust. He helped with small tasks, guided community members through the rougher parts of his land, and shared his knowledge of survival in the desert. More importantly, he listened. He learned about traditions, stories, and lessons passed down through generations. The experience had opened his eyes to a world he had long ignored, a world filled with resilience, history, and community that thrived despite challenges. John also began to see his role differently. The ranch, once simply a place of isolation, now became a place of refuge and care. He maintained the trails, cleared broken branches, and made small improvements to ensure safety for anyone passing through. He thought about children like Marissa, imagining how they might travel the land and the risks they could face. Each small effort became a tribute to her memory, a way to prevent tragedy and honor the life that had been lost. In this way, John's solitude was no longer empty. It had a purpose beyond himself. Evenings became times of reflection. Sitting by the fire, he would watch the sky darken over the distant hills, the stars appearing one by one like silent witnesses. The silence no longer felt oppressive. It felt sacred. In these moments, he thought about Marissa, not as a victim, but as a brave, spirited girl who had faced challenges far beyond her years. He imagined her curiosity, her laughter, and the small acts of courage she had shown. Though her life had been tragically short, John realized that memory and remembrance could give it meaning. Honoring her story had become a part of his own life, a responsibility he would carry forward. John's perspective on solitude had shifted. Before, he had valued it as an escape, a place to avoid pain, disappointment, and connection. Now he understood that solitude was not isolation from life. It was space for reflection, growth, and preparation for engagement with the world. He found that he could still enjoy quiet moments alone on the ranch, but he could also reach out to others, share his knowledge, and support his neighbors. His life was no longer defined solely by distance from people, but by the balance of connection and independence, of care and contemplation. The animals on the ranch seemed to notice the change in him as well. The dogs followed him more closely on his walks, and the horses were calmer, responding to his steady presence. John spoke to them as he always had, but now with a gentleness that carried both sorrow and understanding. He often imagined Marissa walking these same trails, perhaps noticing the same birds, the same wind patterns, the same hills. Though she was gone, her memory lingered in the land, in the animals, and in the work John performed each day. It was a quiet, invisible presence guiding him, reminding him, and connecting him to something larger than himself. John also began to share his experience more openly with the town. He attended small gatherings where community members discussed safety, awareness, and the care of children. He spoke about his observations of the land, about the importance of vigilance, and about the lessons learned from Marissa's story. His words were measured, reflective, and empathetic. He avoided blame or anger, focusing instead on practical wisdom and compassion. People listened, and slowly, John became more than a solitary rancher. He became a voice of experience, a bridge between the remote ranchlands and the wider community. Winter arrived, bringing cold nights and occasional snow. The landscape, once harsh and unwelcoming, now felt alive with memory and possibility. John would walk the trails in the quiet mornings, noticing the tracks left by birds, foxes, and deer. Each imprint in the snow reminded him of the rhythms of life, the resilience of nature, and the connection between living beings. He thought about Marissa's journey, her bravery, and her determination. Though her life had been brief, the lessons it carried were enduring, touching everyone who had been involved, including him. As spring approached, John began tending a small section of the ranch with a focus on children and families. He cleared a safe path near the northern trail and added simple signs to guide travelers. He invited local families and community leaders to walk the trails, to learn about the land, and to reflect on the importance of safety and care. These small actions were quiet gestures of remembrance, ways to honor Marissa's life while contributing positively to the community. Each step taken on these paths carried meaning, connecting past sorrow with present purpose. John's reflections deepened over time. He realized that while he could not change what had happened, he could shape how he lived in response. Marissa's story had awakened something in him, a commitment to empathy, awareness, and responsibility. The ranch was no longer merely a place of isolation. It was a place where memory, action, and care could coexist. He had discovered that even in solitude, one could find ways to impact the world positively, to honor lives lost, and to foster understanding and compassion. He also found comfort in small daily rituals. Mornings began with feeding the animals and inspecting the fences as they always had. But now he included quiet moments of reflection, thinking about Marissa, her journey, and her courage. He tended the garden more carefully, appreciating the cycles of growth and change. He would watch the sunrise over the hills and feel gratitude for the beauty of the world, even in the midst of grief. These routines gave him structure, purpose, and a sense of continuity, reminding him that life continued even after tragedy. In the evenings, John would often take a walk along the trail near the mesquite tree. He would stop for a moment, looking at the landscape she had traversed. The wind would rustle through the branches, the light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the ground. He would whisper her name softly, imagining her presence among the hills, the trees, and the animals. Though she was gone, the memory of her life had become a companion, a reminder of the courage, resilience, and fragility of human existence. Over time, John realized that his life had been transformed. The solitude he had once prized had given him knowledge, patience, and resilience. But it was the connection, even in tragic circumstances, that had changed him most profoundly. He had learned that empathy could emerge from isolation, that responsibility could bridge distance, and that memory could transform grief into action. Marissa's life, though brief, had taught him lessons he would carry forever. The ranch remained his home, his sanctuary, and his responsibility. But it was no longer a place of mere survival. It had become a place of reflection, learning, and connection. John worked diligently to maintain it, to care for the animals, and to honor the memory of the young girl who had unknowingly touched his life so deeply. The land carried her story now, and in caring for it, he cared for her memory, ensuring it would not fade with time. As the seasons turned, John found a quiet peace. He continued his work, rode the trails, and tended the ranch, but now with a sense of purpose beyond routine. He had been drawn out of solitude by tragedy, but he had emerged with understanding, compassion, and a connection to the wider world. Marissa's story had left an indelible mark, transforming both his life and the way he viewed the world. Though he would never forget the sorrow, he had discovered hope, purpose, and the enduring power of memory to shape action, compassion, and human connection.